Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Foreign Correspondents Club of Hong Kong's conversation with Mark Thompson, former BBC Director-General and New York Times CEO, coming to us from New York. This is another in our Zoom events of world thinkers. So we're very excited to have Mark. This conversation will be moderated by our own FCC First Vice President, Eric Wishart. And they'll be talking about, with concerns rising about the editorial independence of our Hong Kong public broadcaster, RTHK, Mark Thompson, who was a former BBC Director-General, will discuss his experience as the head of the public broadcaster there, facing political and governmental pressure. He had served as head of the BBC for 8 years before taking over as president and CEO of the New York Times. He took over the BBC in 2004. After the resignation of Greg Dyke in the aftermath of the war in Iraq, and had to deal with accusations of political bias in the corporation's domestic and international coverage. He joined the New York Times in 2012. Under his leadership, digital subscribers jumped to nearly 6 million, up from 500,000 when he had first joined, and digital revenue topped 450 million at the end of 2019. And for the past 4 years, as people well know, the paper had been a regular target of President Donald Trump, who branded it an enemy of the people, and the failing New York Times. Mark Thompson stepped down as CEO earlier this year, has not yet announced his future plans, but maybe Eric can get that out of him today. We will be entertaining questions as well. Please send them to question, that's singular, question@fcchk.org. Again, question@fcchk.org, and we'll try to get some questions asked. And with that, I give you Mark Thompson and Eric Wishart.
Thank you, Jodie, and welcome everybody. Good evening, Mark. I believe you're in New York.
I am. I'm on the Upper West Side on a rather chilly evening. So it's as you know, it's we're well behind you guys in so many ways. But it's a cold November evening in a rather deserted New York.
I was gonna, before we start, I was just going to ask you, what's it like in New York at the moment? I mean, what's it like with the virus and also with what's been going on with the election? What's the general atmosphere like?
Well, I mean, there's a lot going on here. New York was very badly hit in the first wave of coronavirus in the spring. Actually, has so far. I think both the state and the city have done a reasonably good job. And although coronavirus is rising here, it's not rising as badly as it is in some other parts of the country. They've shut the schools this week. That's over the last few days. I think that's in some ways prophylactic. I think that's to prevent things getting worse. So I think the mood in the city, insofar as I can judge it, is relatively calm. People are getting sick of, the consequences, and unlike much of East Asia, we've not really moved on beyond quite tough measures. And the city, which is normally, anyone who knows New York in the run-up to Thanksgiving and Christmas knows it's usually heaving with tourists. I was at the Rockefeller Center, passing Rockefeller Center the other day. Streets deserted, and the entrance to the place where you buy your tickets to go to the top of 30 Rock to get the view, 3 guards, 2 receptionists, not a single punter, not one. And of course the theaters are closed. The restaurants are kind of open, but it's with a lot of outside dining, and it's getting pretty chill now. So that's a little bit less attractive. So very quiet, very subdued, though this is a predominantly Democrat city. And there is, I think, it's fair to say, considerable optimism about the new president. When the moment when the networks announced the projection of Biden as president, we were here in our dining room in our apartment in the Upper West Side. You could hear outside. I mean, this incredible noise. I mean, you opened the window and started using the phone to record the sort of sound of pots and pans and car horns and all the rest of it. So there was a 24 hours of celebration in New York, despite coronavirus.
Interesting. Thanks. So I'd like to begin with your time at the BBC, and then we move on to the New York Times, and to sort of get right into the heart of the discussion, as Jodie said. there's a lot of concern about the future of RTHK, and I sent you the article. You read it. That was published in the last day or so in the Sichuan Morning Post about RTHK, and the headline is "Hong Kong's RTHK under siege. Should it be a public broadcaster or government mouthpiece?" And the piece goes into the challenges facing RTHK. There was the suspension of a satirical program. Recently, there was an investigative reporter was arrested. So, first of all, you know, having headed up the world's first and biggest public broadcaster, and I think it's this something that people probably aren't that always that clear on. What's the difference between a public broadcaster and state media? How would you define the difference?
I think I think it's a good place to start. And I should just say that, I mean, I've visited RTHK many times over the years, been interviewed by them, have colleagues there, and regard RTHK as a sister broadcaster. So, you know, I think when you threaten one public broadcaster, you kind of threaten them all in a way. It's a bit like NATO. It's an attack on one is an attack on all. So I do feel for the, whatever the rights and wrongs of it, I do feel very much for my colleagues there. But look, everywhere in the world, and this is true of Western liberal democracies, it's true of controlled societies, the notion of editorial independence by a public broadcaster from the government of the day and from political influence by the politicians of the day is a pretty fragile thing in many ways. It really depends on a group of very powerful people exercising self-restraint. It's like a self-denying ordinance, that even when this broadcaster has journalism, or in the case of RTHK, maybe a satirical program, which criticizes us, which ridicules us, or which reveals something we don't want to be revealed, we're not going to intervene. We're not going to stop them, because we think it's in the greater public good that there should be a exchange of ideas, that journalists should be allowed to hold governments to account, and to, you know, in the kind of zeitgeist, to mock everyone, including the powerful in the land. Now that you know, this can be enshrined in charters like the BBC's charter and the charter of many public broadcasters. The truth is, it took years for it to really develop at the BBC. The BBC, when it was first founded, didn't really live up to that idea of independence, though very powerful political interests in the UK still thought it was an absolute thorn in their side. Notably, Winston Churchill, one of the greatest prime minister of modern centuries, hated the BBC and hated the idea of having an, in quotes, public broadcaster who was outside his control. It's a simplification, but I think that's basically true. So everywhere it's fragile. It comes under pressure in the UK, arguably this year under Boris Johnson's government, particularly before coronavirus, it seemed to come under acute pressure. And the government's just announced there's going to be an inquiry, yet another inquiry. I don't know how many there have been since in my career into public service broadcasting and the BBC. But the truth is, so far, although it's kind of sometimes a bit battered, and there's no doubt that the BBC's funding has been squeezed, the most effective political tool for trying to weaken the BBC in the UK has turned out to be basically to throttle its funding, to kind of put your foot on the artery which brings the blood into the BBC, which pays for everything. But I would say that broadly, the societal consensus about independence, editorial independence, and the legitimacy of a public broadcaster holding government and other powerful interests to account, that is still holding. But if you look at Eastern Europe, where there were straightforward state broadcasters, no, they were essentially an arm of government projecting what the government wanted the public to see and hear. This is true throughout, for example, Middle and Central and Eastern Europe, all the way through the communist era. When communism ended, 89, 90 in the early 90s, these broadcasters started making steps from being state broadcasters, i.e. essentially under political control, and almost a branch of the propaganda department. sometimes not even almost, sometimes straightforwardly a branch of the propaganda department. They did try to move progressively towards being independent public service broadcasters with editorial independence. At the same time, as they were also trying to compete with what in many countries was emerging new commercial media. Unfortunately, roll the clock on to 2020, and not in all, but in many, arguably most Central and Eastern European countries, they've slid back again. And actually, as is true in Russia as well, not just the public broadcaster, but essentially the commercial broadcasters have also come under the sway of government and political control. So there are no choices. There are no truly independent broadcasters at all. And I think it's for others to say exactly where RTHK is in that story. I think many people would say, there was an expert from a think tank making the point, which I believe is true, that in the colonial era, when the British were in charge of Hong Kong, RTHK was not given the same freedom that the BBC had, or didn't choose to exercise the same freedom. After the handover, clearly for some years, RTHK made real efforts to try and be dispassionate and objective in the way it covered, let's say, the recent, the last year's disruptions and the government and the protesters. It feels like they're under more pressure. But I want to say this principle is now under pressure almost everywhere, one way or another. And in countries which don't really have any big commitment more broadly to democracy, and who actually genuinely believe or claim to believe that solidarity, focus on, as well, what we all agree on is good and everything else is not legitimate and valuable, but actually is illegitimate and criminal, it's not surprising that a public broadcaster gets pressure, acute pressure from the authorities, and that seems to be playing out in Hong Kong as it is in so many other countries.
Can we go back to your time in the BBC? I mean, you took over from Greg Dyke, who resigned after the Hutton inquiry into the BBC, roughly its coverage of the build-up to the war in Iraq, Tony Blair, the government, and the so-called sexing up of the dossier on weapons of mass destruction.
I got a phone call. I mean, as it happens, I was going to the BBC to see. Right. I was running Channel 4 at that point. I was going into the BBC to see whether the BBC should start broadcasting, actually running the Channel 4's channels. And I got a phone call from Greg in the car saying, "Right, I've just decided to resign. You're going to have to come. You're going to have to come back and do it, pal."
What did you feel about that?
Well, I mean, honestly, I'd worked for the BBC for 21, 22 years. Actually, finally, kind of made my escape. Got to Channel 4. Had 2 fabulous years. Great company and great culture. Channel 4, and I wanted to stay, so I didn't want to do it. And I spent the first few months of the process refusing basically to become a candidate. In the end, a number of people persuaded me it was my duty to, the old Lord Kitchener poster, "Your country needs you," that I'd better get back there. I felt badly for Channel 4, and because I'd been so close to Greg when I was at the BBC and close to his predecessor, John Burt, I'd seen what it's like doing that job and the stresses and strains of the job. And by the time I said yes, I signed up, and I didn't ever, as it were, complain or have a day of second guessing myself. But I knew it was going to be tough.
And I mean, one thing that's important to know, Director-General, if you're not familiar with the BBC, you don't know the role, but you say, apart from running the business,
you're a chief executive. You're a chief executive running a big organisation, 20,000 plus organisation, and billions and billions of pounds of turnover. And you're also the editor-in-chief. You're actually personally responsible for everything the BBC broadcasts. So, as we say in the engineering trade, you're a single point of failure, which is, in the end, the accountability comes through one individual in many ways, which is why, depending on how you count it, more than half of Director Generals actually get fired or forced to resign.
I was struck in your book, Enough Said, which is a fascinating analysis of political speech and you draw on the classics from Aristotle, Plato, Socrates. Very interesting. I highly recommend it. But I was quite struck that your beginning in the BBC was dropping a letter of application to become a trainee, right? I think that's how you started in journalism.
Yeah, I started pretty much at the bottom and did most of the jobs. I always said about that job, it's not true of me at the New York Times, but when in that job, by the time I got to be Director General, I was probably mid-40s, but I'd done pretty much every other job.
So what were the pressure points and the political pressure points? I mean, we're talking about political pressure on RTHK, but what were the moments of most pressure and how did it manifest itself when you were in charge of the BBC?
Well, I mean, sometimes it's overt. And there's one example, which I think you'll understand, which is the BBC had an investigative programme, which is prepared about UEFA, FIFA, the global soccer authority, about corruption by the leader of FIFA and some of his colleagues. So it's about how the world governing body of soccer is corrupt. Very powerful documentary, and by the way, proven by subsequent events to be true, and it led to resignations and change and so forth. At this point, England was bidding to host the World Cup, I think in probably maybe 2024, actually, maybe 2020 or 24. And essentially, I mean, very straightforward, I got rung up by the head of the Football Association or in the UK, and I have to say, contacted by ministers, so actually politicians, senior ministers, to be asked, would I mind delaying this documentary until after the vote had been taken by the governing body about where these World Cups are going to do, and I refused. I mean, you can't. I mean, straightforwardly, it's actually in the public interest. The public should know about the body which is going to be making these decisions. So, I mean, politely, I said no. So that was a clear cut of, be a patriot, Mark. Just hold it for a few days so that the country gets a better result. And I felt we couldn't do that and maintain our independence. So that, if you like, is a very, and by the way, I mean, the people who are asking me, I think were actually well-intentioned. I'm not really complaining. I understand if they're doing these jobs and they're trying to land something really big for the country, why you might make that phone call. I don't think you should make the phone call, but I was very sympathetic to their point of view. And I don't really want to criticize them, but I thought that was an example of the system working. They asked, I thought about it. I thought we couldn't do it. And I told them, I'm sorry, we can't do it. We're going to have to broadcast. And that's one kind of thing. But often what's subtler is when, public service broadcasting is about to be reviewed. You've got a new government. I'm thinking now of the Boris Johnson government, which began after the landslide election that Boris won in December last year, December 19. And number 10, the office of the Prime Minister, starts briefing in January. It's going to be payback time, both for the BBC and for Channel 4, the other broadcaster where I was chief executive, because of the way they abused the government during the campaign. So wounded egos inside number 10 felt that the public broadcasters have been too tough. Now the same people are in government, they're going to review public service broadcasting. So maybe there's going to be some retribution. Now, I have to say these briefings were anonymous. I don't know who gave them. I think they were, however, intended. And they may have been intended just to kind of frighten the public broadcasters. The government at that point also announced a boycott of a number of BBC programmes where they thought the questions were too tough. Now that's a rather different thing, and that's not a kind of courteous request you can just agree to or this is a broad front. It's saying the people who hold the purse strings, the people who will ultimately decide the future of the organisations, you've made them angry by the way you've covered a democratic election. What are you going to do about it? And I think that's bad. I don't think governments should do that if you like, in the context of a Western liberal democracy, because it's obviously leveraging the power you have over the future institution to achieve something which is in your kind of fairly narrow personal and collective political interests. So that, I think, is very different from the first case I've given you. I think you have to resist both. But I do want to say, Eric, the one thing I feel, and I feel very, very, feel a lot of empathy with the leaders in Hong Kong. This is planet Earth. It's the real world. The other side are playing for keeps. Hundreds or thousands of jobs are at stake. You want to try and box clever. You want to try and pick your way through this if you can. My view is, in the end, fundamental principles of independence and editorial integrity cannot be. You can't trade them. They're not yours. You're a kind of steward of them. You can't surrender them. But if you say, should you try and figure out ways of getting through it politically and trying to do things which minimize the impact on what the public actually see and hear, and on the jobs and the ability to work of all your journalists and satire writers and all the rest of it, I think you should do that. But unfortunately, there are some lines that you can't cross and still call yourself an editor.
Yeah, you talked about a review process, and I think there's a review going on at RTHK. I think the head of RTHK is going to be changing in the near future as well. So, just following on, what message would you send to the journalists? Obviously, you're talking about lines. Since the national security law was introduced, the red lines are not very clear, probably deliberately not clear. So what sort of advice? And as you say, you also have to be a bit pragmatic, because a lot of jobs, a lot of, RTHK plays an indispensable role in Hong Kong. So how do you balance the two? And one concern
I'm not going to give advice in a world I don't understand. And I want to say, as it were, listening carefully. If you go into your bunker and you're not, because you feel besieged, to change the metaphor, you feel as if you're being surrounded by hostile forces. The risk is you stop listening, and potentially also you start defending the wrong things. The incident you talked about in 2003-04, the so-called dodgy dossier, actually was an example of BBC journalism going wrong. Mistakes were made. I think they were made in good faith, but a number of mistakes were made. The BBC was so focused on the fight it was having for its independence with the government, it didn't adequately address, ultimately the BBC, I think, behaved very properly and did accept. Indeed, Greg Dyke himself accepted that mistakes had been made with the piece, but because of the psychology of being, pressed up against the wall by a government, they didn't dispassionately look at their own work. So you've got to be careful you go on listening and scrutinizing your work. You can be genuinely passionately in favor of independence, but also, accept that all journalism's like fragile and frail. It can sometimes go wrong, often does go wrong. And so there's something about continuing to have the humility to examine your own work honestly as well. And try and figure out a way through it. But I want to say, Eric, I'm kind of neither optimistic nor pessimistic about this, in the sense that the ability to do this kind of journalism by anyone who wants to go on functioning anywhere in any society, absolutely a public broadcaster where funding or the other special privileges are coming essentially directly or indirectly from the government. It depends on the acceptance of all of that by the political power. If the government doesn't want it to exist, it won't exist. And that's just a simple fact of power politics, which is, in the end, they can switch you off, or they can change you from being what you are to something quite different. Those things are, in the end, are politically feasible. They're feasible theoretically, even in a Western democracy. It's harder to do, and it's harder to do it secretly in a Western democracy than in a partially or completely controlled society. It can happen everywhere, and there are plenty of Western countries where the public broadcaster, the Director-General, or the President or whatever, changes with government.
Mhm.
So the government, the President of the Republic or whoever, thinks it's in their gift, and they'd like their person in when they're in power. For many years, Rai, the public broadcaster in Italy, in a rather Italian compromise, different television channels would be given to people of different political leanings. So Rai Tre, for example, was always run by the communists, and there was a conservative channel and a socialist channel and a communist channel, and so there are lots of. I mean, we shouldn't pretend that there's some pure model. I do think the BBC has remained over decades a beacon of objectivity and independence, but you can see if you look at the internet or the news, it pays for it constantly with noise and controversy.
I'd like to, I mean, the first time we met, I think it was 2010, we were in Beijing for what was billed as the World Media Summit. In fact, it was a follow-up meeting that they called the Presidium of the World Media Summit, if you remember, at the State Guest House, Dayutai. And it was organized by Xinhua News Agency. And since then, the Chinese state media has expanded and invested a lot internationally. CGTN has expanded. What's your view on this? I mean, this falls into China's soft power. What's your view on the expansion of the Chinese media around the world? And also the China Daily appeared as inserts, I think, including in the New York Times. So what's your feeling about that?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think there's two or three things going on. The other thing about that rather strange meeting in Beijing, actually, I have to say, enjoyable. And I have to say, I also thought a pretty open dialogue. I did not think it was a constricting dialogue. I think it was the first time I met Arthur Oxholzberger Jr., the chairman and publisher of the New York Times, which turned out to be a significant.
I always wondered if that was the start of the story. Mark,
I think it's one of the threads. We both remember it. I mean, I have to say, I didn't have a clue in my head I'd move on to go on and work for the Times. I don't think Arthur thought that either. But nonetheless, that was significant. Well, look, I mean, the way I think about it is dialogue between China and the rest of the world, a chance for Chinese people to learn more about the rest of the world and the rest of the world to learn more about China is a good thing. And if you say, well, what the rest of the world hears about China from Chinese state media sources will not be the full unvarnished truth, I don't think it renders what they do worthless. I think that although it's probably true that for a complete picture you want to add other sources, and I think in the same way, it may be that the way Chinese media filters the rest of the world is not as complete as it might be for similar reasons. I think, however, this kind of dialogue is good, and let's imagine an alternative world where China becomes the most powerful country on the planet economically, but is hermetically sealed both ways from the rest of the world. I think that will be a dark place. It's what Orwell imagines, really, of three global kind of operating systems, if you like, Oceania, Eurasia, and East Asia. East Asia is clearly meant to be China, Oceania is the US, all living in their own bubbles and with kind of lies and conspiracy theories about each other. That feels very unhealthy to me. So I think as it happens, I think that the idea of Western audiences having access to, China Daily and RT from the Soviet Union and the Iranian news service and Al Jazeera and all that. I mean, I would say, to that extent, let people choose. And similarly, I would say, in a way that what I recognize is politically it's not where China is now. I believe that letting people within China over time, if necessary, if it needs to be done step by step, so be it. Undesirable, but so be it. Over time, letting the people of China get a broader range of perspectives of what's happening in their own country and in the rest of the world will strengthen China, not weaken it. Now, I would say that, and I recognize that the culture I've grown up in is profoundly different from the culture in which Chinese decision makers have grown up. And they will be the best judges I know in their own minds anyway about what's best for China. But I just want to say that this interplay of perspectives on each other's worlds and each other's lives, and where commonality is possible, I think great things can be done. I mean, it's a relatively small thing. But one of the things I was very proud of is in my time as editor-in-chief of the BBC, we made a really wonderful partnership documentary series. It was called Wild China in English and Beautiful China in Chinese. And it was a portrait over 6 documentaries of the natural world of China and its many diverse regions. And I think that doesn't hurt anyone. I mean, and it's wonderful to show those natural beauties and treasures to the rest of the world, and wonderful for Chinese people to celebrate their amazing country. So I think looking for win-wins in this mess is really important, though, I mean, I'm a journalist at heart, and I believe that natural history is really important. I think investigative journalism is really important, and I'm very proud of some of the investigative journalism that the New York Times and the BBC have done over the years about what's happening inside China.
So let's move to the New York Times then. I asked A.G. Sulzberger, you talked about Arthur. So A.G. was here a couple of years ago in person, and I asked him, I opened by asking him what the publisher of the New York Times does. So what was your job as a journalist and CEO also of the New York Times? What was your role? I mean, AG did the digital innovation report, and then did you pick the ball up and run with it, or how did it?
I want to say that AG and I were partners and had been partners from a point long before he became publisher of the New York Times. Right. And firstly, my job at the Times, I was chief executive. I had nothing to do with the editorial decision making at the Times. It's the first time in my life I wasn't doing both. I'd always done both at the same time. And if you'd asked me, I'd have said, actually, I'm an editor who's doing a bit of management on the side, or a creative leader doing a bit of management, not a business side person at all. And in fact, the term, I only heard it because in broadcasting, like you don't really have a business side, and you may have a sales department. That's a different thing. So my job was over 8 years to try and move the organization much more quickly towards its digital future. And it was about coming up with a vision and a strategy, setting goals of trying to get the company to focus on digital subscription, and to work with AG in the newsroom to inspire the newsroom to take part in the conversation. At the BBC, I'd first discovered that and I was in the early 90s, so 20 years earlier, I'd been one of the kids. The then Director-General John Burt did what he called a program strategy review. Let's look at all of the output of the organization. But instead of getting the bosses to do it, why don't you get some kids in their late 20s, 30s, maybe early 40s, kind of, iconoclasts and rebels, get them to do a piece about what's going on and what the future looks like, and then use that to challenge the bosses. That's a slight exaggeration, but that's basically what happened. So at the Times when I arrived, we thought, why can't we do something like that here? And we got Arthur Gregg Sulzberger, who at that point was an editor, not a particularly senior editor in the newsroom, to lead a group of young people, and that was the innovation report.
Right.
And that was a catalyst. And the great danger, and some of the people in the school probably have been victims of this danger, is that the bosses of a media company who are worried about a legacy media company, newspaper, broadcast or whatever, will get a group of distinguished consultants in, and the consultants will go around with clipboards and talk to everyone. And then the hapless chief executive will walk into the newsroom with a kind of PowerPoint display to tell everyone how they've got to change, which, believe me, because I've kind of tried it this way as well in an earlier life, doesn't go down well with journalists.
Mm-hmm.
It's much better if they're telling you how you need to change and how you need to get on and how you need to hurry up. And in a way, the innovation report was part of actually the newsroom telling the whole organization, we know we've got to change, we've got to go faster. And from that, we developed a strategy which essentially said, we're a subscription-first business. We believe there's immense demand for what we do in America and around the world. We can massively increase our digital subscriptions. And in fact, we can build our core business, digital business, so quickly, it's going to overwhelm the inevitable decline on the print side. And meanwhile, we can launch other products. We can launch a cooking product. We can launch a crosswords product. We can start doing podcasts. We can start doing TV and all the rest of it. So it was really getting on the front foot, really looking at the wonderful journalism the Times does and its great brand, and just getting behind that and saying there's no reason why it can't be just as relevant on this thing and just as relevant for someone under the age of 30 as it always was for people of my age and my colour, sitting here we are in the Upper West Side of New York, you know, kind of reading the physical paper. There's no reason why you can't port all of that and reinvent it for a completely different moment.
I'd like to, we've got some questions from the audience, and there's actually, I would like to actually put two questions into one. There's one from, gotta put my glasses on, Matthias Bock, and he says, he talks about the New York Times, and obviously it's been very successful, but is it too big and too influential in its market, sucking up resources that some years ago, for example, would have secured the survival of local newspapers, which we all know are dwindling in numbers? And then we just got a sort of parallel question from Richard Ward. Is there a need in the US to require the ownership of newspapers, radio and TV stations to be less concentrated and more widely dispersed? I mean, that's both from an editorial.
No, I get it. You should pity me. I spent years and years as a program maker and then an executive in the BBC being told that you couldn't do anything in the UK because the BBC was too big. Right. I go to America, everyone thinks the New York Times is going to go out of business. Now they're saying the only problem we've got is the New York Times is too big. I mean, to state the obvious, the entire international strategy of the New York Times, and by the way, this is a really important part of strategy, is that in Hong Kong, in France, in Malaysia, in Brazil, in Russia, we're not going to be the first thing people look at or read for news. We're going to be the second or the third or the fourth, and we're going to be competing with CNN or the Wall Street Journal or the Washington Post or the BBC. You know, I mean, and the idea that people only want one source of news and will only pay for one source of news has got about as much validity as saying people will only pay for one source of entertainment, when we know that they'll. I agree, they're not going to pay for 10 kinds of news, but the New York Times is never going to cover local news in Hong Kong as well as local media. Mm-hmm. Not our job, and we're just never going to do it. People care about local news. In fact, honestly, most news is either local or certainly regional and national. And we're not going to compete there. We won't cover Cleveland as well as the Plain Dealer and local TV does. We won't. And so we're there for making sense of the world at a national and global level, and providing a really rich kind of guide to culture, entertainment, sport, and so on. Essentially with the idea that we do stuff in Hong Kong, not for just people who live in Hong Kong, but for people who live everywhere and who are interested in Hong Kong. So we're local to global. That's only one part of the media market. So, and by the way, the New York Times is tiny relative to, the Walt Disney Company or Netflix or Google or Facebook. You cannot look at us and think we're big. We're a $7 billion market cap compared to like $1 trillion for the major platforms. I think we're just about as small as you can be and survive. And if you ask me a different question, you say, well, okay, if you think the New York Times is actually small, not big, what the hell's going to happen to truly local news organizations, we have to come up with new answers. We haven't got the answers at the moment.
What do you think? I mean, I was going to ask you that. I mean, and it's been exacerbated by the pandemic. On one hand, we need journalism, obviously, more than ever, and at the same time, I mean, the business is the economy is suffering, and local papers are suffering. So, and I've read interviews with you where you say, you know, if you're going to expand digitally, you've got to invest, you've got to be brave. So, I mean, for smaller news outlets without the resources of a New York Times, how can they survive?
Yeah, you've got to give up the drug of advertising as well,
Right.
and which is hard. It's kind of like a pretty painful withdrawal of that. But the point about advertising is advertising in the print era, and by the way, the linear television era, was actually a very nice revenue stream for journalism, to fund journalism and high quality content. Not many people had the spectrum, they didn't have the airwaves, and therefore you could charge a lot for it. And even with newspapers, kind of setting up a printing plant and getting a set of trucks and making your paper, again, quite high barriers to entry. If you were the New York Times, you were really the dominant upmarket newspaper in New York City. You could charge, you know, Bergdorf Goodman a fortune for a full page ad in the New York Times. That's how the business model worked. In digital, it's just not like that. Everyone's selling advertising, and some of the people selling advertising are people like Google and Facebook. And believe me, they can undercut you and deliver better data and better audiences in many ways. So it's not a winner. So you've got to rebase in economics, which either sees a modest contribution from advertising or none. And so you've just got to reinvent it. And the thing is, most American newspapers and most European newspapers, and I've no reason to think the same is true in Asia as well, used to charge users a cover price. People will pay for news. The whole notion they won't pay for news is kind of based on a version of the internet circa 1999. It's like, you know, everything's free on the internet and audiences will be so big, the economics will be fine. Nobody in entertainment, everyone charges for entertainment now. Not everyone, but very substantially. People, if you want to see Disney's output streamed, you get Disney Plus, you get Netflix, you get Amazon Prime, and so on. So, to me, it's about rebasing in economics. And at a local level, it's going to be supporters. It's going to be people who, frankly, pay much more than their fair share because they believe in their community. So you get some wealthy donors and backers. It's going to be people who do pay something. It's going to be potentially philanthropies and foundations at a national level in the US, for example. There may be some commercial sponsorship, and there may be some advertising. It's going to be, and there may be partnerships with J schools or other bits of kind of media infrastructure. So, and there are some interesting examples. I spent some of my time in Maine, in northern New England, and there's a great website called Maine Monitor, which includes, absolutely, in some ways, is focused around accountability journalism, what's happening in Augusta, the state capital, governor, you know, and the different departments of the state, investigations into individual politicians. I mean, they're doing great work, and it's, you know, it's lightweight. It's a website, but it's as good as any of the newspapers that I look at in Maine. So I think I think one of the things I want to say is, I mean, I sort of feel, particularly for the last 10, 15 years, I've been in an industry which is, you know, where the defeatists have got the loudest voice. And I think it's maybe a fact of life about journalists in particular. They tend to see the dark side of everything. And I do want to say, I do hope that the way in which we got the Times from a New York Times from a bad place to a really quite a good place should be seen not as proof that nobody else can ever do it because the Times has eaten everyone's lunch, but rather that it can be done. I mean, if a bit of belief in what you do and in the product. And, you know, at the Times, we haven't talked about this, but we hired journalists. I mean, when everyone else was firing journalists, we were hiring them and making our newsroom bigger because we believe in journalism. And actually, part of the story is of that kind of belief in the profession actually working because the public believe in journalism too. So all that kind of social, all that kind of cultural pessimism, people don't want to read anything anymore. People they only want rubbish and infotainment. They don't want serious news, in particular young people. Nobody will ever pay for anything. The only money you can get on the internet is through advertising. All of that stuff, I think, is not true. It's very widely believed, but it's very widely believed by the middle-aged people who run media. It's not actually believed by the public.
What do you think of the role of the platforms? I mean, you mentioned Google, and in Europe, we had the neighboring rights, you know, the copyright, and so that media could share a slice of the pie that of the money that Google makes out of content. So how do you see Google and the other platforms fitting into this?
Well, my view is I'm not always popular with my kind of, you know, people on my side of the fence on the kind of publishing side. I take the view firstly that most of what's happened to journalism around the world is because of the intervention of the internet. And if it wasn't Google, supposing there was in an alternative reality, there were 4 or 5 competing search engines, there are reasons to believe that actually you would probably end up with one and tiddlers around it. But let's imagine there were a number and they were competing. I think if you're an advertiser, that would be good because they will be competing against each other and the price of advertising would come down. I think publishers would still find it incredibly hard to compete with that group. So I think, honestly, with social media, the same, essentially. And the industry in many countries, not everywhere, but in many countries, gave up on its own businesses very quickly. Classified job advertising, classified real estate. There are some countries and some companies where they fought and they still have got those businesses. Axel Springer in Germany's got it. Schibsted in Norway and Scandinavia, these are both bigger companies, but those are their bases. There were some companies who kind of fought and they actually got market share in digital. Most publishers kind of just didn't do it. They kind of sat there paralyzed as their money was being taken away, which often wasn't by Google and Facebook. I mean, for example, Craig's List, Craig Newmark, who is the founder of Craig's List, God bless him, is really focused on journalism, gives a lot of his fortune, I mean, real money to help support journalism. I mean, but Craig's List played a bigger role in the transfer of classified advertising from newspapers to the internet than Google or Facebook did. Having said that, honestly, I mean, Google and Facebook have got big political issues now. They're being pursued by regulators and politicians pretty much everywhere you look, from Australia to Europe, as you say, and now to the US, and the Trump Department of Justice and Federal Trade Commission are both pursuing the big platforms, and I'm sure they will under President Biden as well. I think it will be sensible of the big platforms to be seen to do more to support high quality content, and in particular journalism, to be more careful about letting fake news on their websites. And you can see they're trying. I mean, you may not feel they're trying hard enough yet, but I think they are really trying now to get that right. And they've been trying through this US election. I'm afraid in other countries where their influence can be colossal, they're not trying hard enough yet, actually. Right. But I think that if they step up to the mark, it's possible to imagine that these big platforms could also be part of that funding solution for local journalism that I talked about earlier.
You also mentioned passing Trump. I mean, what was it like being the CEO of a company when you had the president calling you fake news, enemy of the people, and I mean, you were in charge of the business, and he said it was the failure.
Actually, funny, you mentioned the book I read. I mean, I finished that draft, I think, in 2015 or very early 2016, really before it was clear that Trump was going to be the candidate, let alone president. But I sort of clocked Mr. Trump and thought, by the way, he was going to win in 2016. The hardback was published before the result, after Brexit, but before Trump. Trump's a populist, and populists say, you know, controversial, loud things for effect. That's part of the way they work. And honestly, I think Mr. Trump part of his thing was establishment media. He's a New Yorker who grew up in Queens, never felt he was accepted by Manhattan society. And I think he thought of the New York Times as being that, though frankly, the New York Times is now a global player. It's not really the New York Times is not really the New York newspaper he thinks it is. But he came to lunch with us just after the election 4 years ago. And on that day, he said he thought the New York Times was a jewel for America and the world. So
You were at
go
lunch with
figure.
Trump. You had lunch with Trump.
Yes.
Did you know him from before, or was that the first time you met him?
It's one and only time I met him. And I asked him whether he was going to defend the First Amendment, the amendment which includes press freedom, as president. And he said, I think you'll be all right. And actually, I have to say, I mean, there's some weeks to go yet, but actually the First Amendment and press freedom has been maintained under the Trump administration by and large. I mean, there have been some quite troubling individual incidents, pursuit of leakers and with dragging journalists into the leak inquiries. That was happening under the Obama administration as well. But you can't, although Donald Trump has railed against the press, he's abused us. He said some very irresponsible things about journalists. Enemies of the people is, it's no skin off my nose, quite honestly. I mean, whatever, noise. But if you're actually a working reporter out there in the street, in particular, let's say reporting on a Trump rally, that phrase "enemies of the people" can feel like a provocation and an incitement to violence against journalists. So I'm not suggesting that he hasn't been very rude, but his attacks on the media have been like that. They've been verbal threats and verbal abuse. He's not attempted to undermine the Constitution or to literally use the powers of the state to stop journalism happening. And you can't say that about him.
I have a question, and I'm afraid I don't know who actually asked it, but from Mike, that was from Michael Connolly, right? Asking, one of the Times' big successes has been the Daily, the podcast.
Yeah.
How do you see podcasts as a potential revenue maker for newspapers? What's your view on?
I mean, at one level, I mean, it's one of these classic sort of innovations. It's fantastic. I mean, it's a wonderful reinvention of some of the magic of radio. The intimacy, the way you get involved, you get drawn into a story. The fact that you can be doing it while you're and really listening to it and really focusing on it as you're driving or preparing food or whatever. You can do something else at the same time. So it really fits into people's lives, particularly in the morning. People love to have at the weekend or to run to. People out there jogging in Central Park listening to their podcast. So it's fantastic. It's not like making a TV show. It's cheap and cheerful to make. So it's low cost. It's very easy to get on big platforms. Because of that, of course, the market is flooded with podcasts and it's hard to punch through. So you've got to be, I think the key thing is, in its own way, it's not, it's like an exercise in Swiss watchmaking. It rewards precision, expertise, finesse. It's a delicate thing, and the difference between a hit and a magical podcast and something which is humdrum is enormous, but it's subtle. And in fact, the world is full of pretty good podcasts, most of which will never punch through because there's so many other pretty good podcasts. So you need specialists, and we at the Times, we hired people who had great track records from radio, essentially, but who got a bit impatient with radio and it's kind of slightly tired tropes and kind of ways of making shows, and wanted to reinvent. So they were people in their mid careers. They were the ones who were kind of been kind of held down by the people above them. We kind of rescued them and told them, say, well, invent podcasting for us. So I think it's great, but you've got to treat it with respect and invest in it.
putting your journalist hat on for a minute as we're getting to the end. I've got another question from Matthias Bock, which was about the resignation of James Bennett over the Tom Cotton comment editorial piece. And
so this was a very controversial essay by a right-wing Republican senator, Tom Cotton, which caused a storm when it was printed. There was a big row about whether it should have been printed and how it was printed. And when I say printed, it was printed and put on the net at the same time. And a few days later, the head of the opinion department, a very senior editor at the Times, James Bennett, resigned. That's just for people who don't know the story. That's the.
I mean, one thing that strikes me in the American media is this sort of church and state. Like the news side is completely separate from the editorial side,
and both are separate from the business side. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, to a non-journalist, does that really fly? Can really people believe that what's in the comment section doesn't come in under the editor in charge of the news side? I mean,
well, I'm here to tell you, I mean, at the New York Times, as it's currently organized, it doesn't. And indeed, when they were building a pretty modern skyscraper, the skyscraper is 15 years old, perhaps, they actually took care not to build a floor, a staircase between the editorial department and the newsroom. So there's no, you can go in the elevator, but you can't actually go up the stairs to try and keep the physical separation. So it's kind of, it's a very kind of purist thing, this. The newsroom was not involved in that, and I mean, it was a really I think tough and sad episode. James was a brilliant editor, had done brilliant work with the opinion department, and you know, one of the things he'd been, I think, very successful at, and it's continued after his departure, is getting a broader range of voices, including conservative, including very strongly conservative opinion pieces into the New York Times. This piece, the publisher, who we talked about, Arthur Gregg Salzberger, who was in charge of this rather than me, I wasn't involved in it directly at all. AG judged that in the end, the piece had not gone through its paces properly, it hadn't been properly checked. It certainly should have been changed in various ways, was his finding. James, in fact, had not read the piece before it was.
I know, he hadn't read it, which struck me.
And it felt that those failings were very serious, and James left really as a result of that and that determination. But I mean, my own view, and I wasn't part of it, is there's no reason why a very strongly worded piece by a conservative senator. At that moment, the piece was about basically that Cotton was arguing that it was appropriate to put US troops on the streets of American cities to restore order. A piece which, of course, has got curious echoes when we talk about Hong Kong, making the case for law and order, even if it means putting down street protests, was what the subject of the piece was. At the time, Cotton wrote it. And again, it's also interesting for an audience in Hong Kong to hear, probably half the US population took the same view. And this was because at that moment there was a moral panic about Black Lives Matter protests, which were also said to have radical leftists. It's unclear, certainly included some looting early on, though that was diminishing. There was a fear that these protests were getting out of hand. It wasn't true, and they actually very quickly became more peaceful. And then they kind of stopped. So the truth about the Cotton piece is it ended up 3 or 4 days after, well, certainly within a week of being published, of being rather irrelevant because it was a problem which sorted itself out. And actually, most people, I think, would say the fundamental right to protest should have been, and generally was accepted by the authorities. Though there were some troubling examples of a peaceful protest in Washington, D.C., very close to the White House, which it would appear the Trump administration used tear gas and horses and God knows what to suppress, largely so that the president could have a photo opportunity.
Yes. I just want to ask a couple of more questions. One, following on from that, why does the New York Times, why do American papers keep endorsing their candidates? The Washington Post endorsed Biden, New York Times endorsed Biden. Is that not a bit preaching to the choir, but at the same time raising a question over your impartiality or so-called editorial?
I'm a Brit and I grew up in the BBC, and I've slightly scratched my head about it as well. But it's a time-honoured tradition here, and I think, to be fair, everyone knows what's going on there, which is the editorial, which is the opinion of the editorial board. You know, for what it's worth, if you're looking for someone to advise you how to vote, the editorial board of the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal, by the way, the Economist does this as well. For example, if you want a British newspaper, which does, sure. Most British newspapers do this as well. It's a newspaper tradition. I slightly struggle. You know, I'm sort of broadly happy to make up my own mind about who to vote for. Thank you, but what I want from. I do find opinion pieces very useful, hearing different, you know, attacks, and I'm the kind of person I like to read opinions I don't naturally agree with, in the hope I might learn something. And I sometimes change my mind because of opinion pieces, which makes me a part of 1% of the population, I think. But no, it's an example of something which still, actually, in the context of the New York Times, has some political value and importance. But I agree. I find it somewhat curious in 2020.
So as an author yourself, we would like to ask you, as you know, it's a bit of a tradition now with our speakers. What are you reading at the moment?
Okay. Well, at the moment, I'm trying to write a novel. Don't worry, it's going to be a few years in the making. There's no risk you're going to bump into them in the bookstore anytime soon. But it's set in the 17th century. I've got a pile of, you know, history books about late 17th century English politics and God knows what there. But I've just started this book. It came out a few years ago. Why Liberalism Failed, by Patrick J. Deneen, which is actually, it's quite very challenging and interesting. Has liberalism failed? He says yes. What is liberalism? I think one of the most persuasive points he makes is that what we call modern conservatism is itself a form of liberalism. And indeed, economic liberalism is that. And it's like, it's not one side of the present political argument in Western societies, which has gone a bit funny. It's both sides, and they both have a common parent. It's a really interesting, surprising book. My recommendation, though, I mean, that's a good chewy read. We've been doing a lot of traveling because of COVID between here and northern Maine, so 8-hour car journeys basically, and there's a wonderful, I think it's Naxos, but it's on Audible and most of the other such services, talking books, reading books. There is a fantastic reading of War and Peace. Right. You'll find it if you look for it, which is something like 75 hours of, but one reader. I haven't got his name, but it's the Naxos unabridged reading. It's just engrossing. It's fantastic, and somehow this one voice managed to bring that extraordinary world of literally hundreds of characters to life. So that's if you're looking for a kind of classic, and one of the stories, certainly in America and the UK of 2020, has been people going back to the classics because of COVID. But you can't be asked to actually read it yourself. That's the thing to go for.
Great, thanks, Mark. So thank you very much. And just one last question: what comes next?
Well, I mean, one or two things. I mean, I don't think we've gone public yet, but I'm going to have one or two more adventures. I'm not planning to do another full-time executive job. That could change, but I think it's I'm going to be doing, I'd say, a number of different things on both sides of the Atlantic, is the hope.
Well, thanks very much. And I hope when you publish your novel, you'll come and talk in person at the FCC.
I'd love to, definitely.
And thank you.
Yeah. Well, thanks, everyone, and good luck. Thank you, Eric. Thank you.
Very interesting. Thank you.